Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Merhaba. And yeah. Does everything work? Yeah. Okay. I'm not here to talk about fixed price laws, but I am a little bit going to, because we've talked about it so much. The first thing I'm going to say is, as an independent research agency, I officially have no opinion on the fixed price law at all, or any fixed price law in any country. However, being people that sort of generally measure things, what happens is everyone asks us to either prove for or against the impact of fixed price. So the thing that I'd like to say is sort of twofold. Any alteration to how a market works has unintended consequences, which can be very hard to measure or actually undo or kind of deal with. Secondly, because there was a lot of talk about internet retail, and I think there may be a kind of misconception that internet retail is only successful because it is cheap. I buy pretty much everything online now, from my groceries through to, so most things. And it's not because it's cheap, it's often more expensive. It's because I hate shopping. And there's a lot of people that hate shopping. So I think it's important to remember and to not be kind of clouded in the vision that fixed price or any kind of price regulation is able to do more than it can. And the third thing in this sort of rant is about innovation. There's an idea that innovation can be fostered because of regulating price. There's an equally counter-argument that innovation can be hindered by having fixed price. So that's my little fixed price rant, but I'll restate, I officially have no opinion on fixed price. I could talk about it pretty much for my entire talk, which I'm not going to do. I'll say one more thing. I keep saying not so much, but any comparisons to the UK market I think is very dangerous, because we have English language, and the English language, out of luck and historical chance, gives us this huge export market, and also with its market conditions is fundamentally different from any other book market. So comparing yourself to the UK or English language book market is not a good comparison, because it's so completely different from anything else. And I know I'm not supposed to talk about that, so now I'm not going to anymore. We'll talk about measuring book markets, how and why we do it. So a little bit about measurement in itself. This we often refer to as the virtuous circle, and it begins with an identifier. And I'm going to have to do the little look around. The identifier, then you need metadata, then you need some kind of transaction services system, and then the last thing you build, but often the one that people know the most about or use the most, is measuring what is sold. But you can only really measure what is sold properly if you have the other pieces. Without it, it's very, very difficult to do, and they're often forgotten. The speaker after me will be talking about some of them as well. A bit about Nielsen, and here I have to be a bit schizophrenic, and I'm very curious what that is in translation. So I'm both Nielsen and not Nielsen. Our business grew up out of a small family book business. Nielsen is a very large market research company that some of you will know from other markets, but we're kind of Nielsen and not Nielsen. So we focus purely on the book market, and it's all we do. Some time back we decided we're going to not be a generalist but be a specialist, and that's just the history. That's a picture of Joseph Whittaker, our founder in 1850, who anyway, there's lots of funny stories about the family, which another day we can talk about. All right. So fundamentally, if you'd like to measure any market, there's a number of different ways you can do that. These are some of the Nielsen ones, but fundamentally all market research companies use things like this, and I'll briefly highlight them. Some of these already exist in Turkey, and other companies do similar things, and just very briefly talk about them. So HomeScan and Spectra, you pay people to, or you incentivize them to record everything they buy for their household and report it. So you can figure out what they buy, and then you statistically represent it. Supermarkets use this in order to understand what people are buying, why they're buying it, and they run their businesses by it. They're old products. Spectra regionalizes that, so you can figure out why are people in a certain region shopping in a different way from people in other regions. Shopper and Nielsen Nero are a bit more advanced. So Nielsen Nero is actually a very modern thing that's increasingly happening, where not only Nielsen does this, but where they monitor people's brain waves in a lab. We have one in London, as they look at packaging, or they have to choose between thing A and B. And it's both really sci-fi, a little bit kind of terrifying, and amazing science, because you can see what people look at with eye tracking. And if you're ever in a supermarket and you wonder, why did I notice this product at a certain shelf height, a lot of money has been spent through these tools in order to make sure the right thing is in the right spot so that you buy it. It's rarely by chance. Some more that do fairly similar things. But then the last one there in the purple, I want to talk about BookScan. And what it basically is. So it measures book markets in, I think, the most fundamental way, by what has the consumer purchased. And it's sales tracking through electronic point of sale. So anybody who goes into any bookshop or buys any book from any internet retailer, you collect the till receipts. It's always annoying. From those, and you collect it at an individual transaction level. So not the summary level, it's not wholesale, it's not the sale from the publisher into the distributor, it is what the end consumer has purchased. That's all that we're interested in. And there's some very good reasons for that, not least the kind of purity of research. And then what you do with that is you match it with your metadata. You weight it, but only for the independents, and but you don't extrapolate. So in statistical terms, weighting and extrapolation are two different things. So you can weight or represent for other retailers, and I'll try and explain it like this. So if you know there are 5 small children's bookshops in a region and only 2 are sending you data, you can then determine that the others are the same size. There's a bunch of ways of doing that. Floor space, number of light bulbs in the shops is a very popular one because it's extremely reliable. Footfall, if you've got footfall measurements, and then you know how big those shops are, and you can use the 2 in order to represent all 5 if they're in the same region and if they sell basically the same thing. Extrapolation would be then taking those 2 and extrapolating for all other shops, which we don't do. So very generally, BookScan or similar measurements always underestimate or are very conservative in how they estimate, because the aim is accuracy, not completeness. You do all this, and then at the end of it, you have a measurement. So to reiterate what it doesn't measure and why, we don't measure any of those things. We actually actively exclude them. So if we see in a retailer a large sort of bulk sale of 10,000 copies, we would query it and remove it, because we're only interested in what the end consumer is buying, not institutional sales. And there's a bunch of reasons for this, including, but almost most important, no double counting. Because if you measure any of these, it becomes really impossible for returns and for stock control to know really how many books are now in the hands of the consumer. So with the little green arrow, that's what we end up really aiming to measure. So fundamentally, that is what we try to do. There are other ways of also measuring your market, and we'll talk a little bit more about those later on. So who contributes? I just put a range of retailers up here. In the markets that we measure, the majority of retailers contribute, including Amazon, anyone from large supermarkets to small retailers to pretty much anyone. I could give you a really, really long list, including the independents. Interestingly, we don't list the independents. I think this is important for a number of reasons. What it does is it prevents people from attempting to cheat the system, and it was very famous in the music industry, because if you're representing from independents, a record executive would figure out that this record shop is in the measurement. So for every record bought there, it actually counts for 5 records. So if they want their record to go up the chart, they send all their staff to all go buy 10 records. And you laugh, we have people phone us up about once every 3 months and ask us, if I wanted to, rig the chart, how could I do that? Could you help me? And we tell them no, but they still phone, which is quite insane. So we don't list the independents for that reason. Also because no independent should be bullied into being in the measurement, because they don't have to join. And that's really quite important. And again, to go back to what I said at first, we're like the Switzerland. We just measure. We're not interested in influencing or bullying or helping the big or the small. We measure reality and report it as close to reality as we can. And that's our role and our position. More retailers. Why do we do this? And this slide in a nutshell shows all the different functions of it, and I will talk about it hopefully in a fairly engaging way, because it is a bit sort of technical. So in the end, if you have a measured market for a publishing business and for a retailer, you can use the data in every single part of your business. From the simplest use, which everyone immediately thinks of, is actually setting your print runs, but you can use it in author acquisition. If you really work hard at it, you can use it in strategy. But now, like any data, if you use it well, it's good. If you use it badly, it's bad. So something that's often asked is, won't it then just be sort of publishing by the numbers and only the same things will be published? If you choose to do that, but that doesn't work that well, and I have an example of that a little bit later on. If I can briefly talk about some of these. So the pricing one is very interesting. Because books are in a way inelastic in price, or they're not as elastic as some other goods. And this idea of how much price influences the number of copies that are sold is very important. If I used to be a chain smoker, and they kept on putting up the cost of cigarettes in the UK, and it had no impact on how many cigarettes I bought. Similarly, for some book buyers in some genres, almost regardless of what the price is, people are going to buy the book. But with anything, there is a kind of breaking point. Equally, actually pricing fairly, so understanding what is an optimal price for something, at which point the majority of your market actually can afford it, is a very useful thing to do. There is no point in selling loads more of something at a lower price if you could have sold a medium amount of it at a significantly higher price. By the same token, if you could lower the price slightly, and it could be fixed price or not fixed price, if you could lower your recommended retail price very slightly and then sort of double your sales, that's a really interesting thing to do. The information also, something that isn't immediately apparent, is because of how it works, everybody can see everybody else's sales. So it isn't like one publisher can only see their own sales. Any publisher can see any other publisher's sales. So people can analyze other successful strategies or unsuccessful strategies. But more on that a little bit later on. This is a really good example of it. So this is out of all the data that I'm going to show is pretty much out of the UK. This is market share information. If I normally say this at the start, I forgot. If anybody would like a copy of the presentation afterwards, give me your email address and I'll email it over to you. And if I forget, email someone from here and they have my email address and they'll email me and I will send it to you. So you don't have to try and write the stuff down. I've also cut out a lot of stuff, and I've only really used UK data because of time. We cover a number of markets from India to Brazil to the UK to Ireland, which are all very different. All right. Simple questions, and if we work kind of through the editorial process. If you have a measured EPOS system yeah, which doesn't have to be us either, I should say that. It could be anyone. You just need a measured EPOS-based sales system. At an editorial point even, you can use it in order to make decisions. At a strategy level, you can make very serious, large-scale business decisions with information rather than without. At sales and marketing, where people normally think about it first, you can make a lot of your decisions and get feedback on an often uncomfortable question of, has my marketing actually achieved anything at all, or should we stop marketing a certain book or even whole genre of books? They're either going to be bought or not. And then the nitty-gritty of it, where having a measurement thing actually pays off probably the most immediately and financially in the supply chain. There was a lot of talk earlier today about returns and then terms. I think it would be fair to say that in the UK and in any market we've started it as a tool, or where similar tools exist, it has massively reduced the number of returns. It makes the whole supply chain much more efficient and really quickly, because the data is weekly at a minimum, though it's sent in daily. So by the end of the next week, you know actually what's in consumers' hands. And because all the actors in the supply chain know that, they have what I would call a common currency. So even if a measurement only covers, like we do in India, about 50% of the market, because everyone knows what the coverage is, everybody knows how it works, everyone knows how that relates actually to their business. It is a known issue, and therefore I know if I have printed 6,000 copies and I have distributed them here and there, I know which retailers are in and which are not. I can work out roughly, do I need to reprint or not? How many returns will be coming or not? And it helps people run their businesses much more efficiently. And I would argue then also almost immediately helps publishing be, and book selling, more sustainable and more diverse with the number of books it can actually support. Saying the same thing that I've said, but in a slightly different way, and it's because of the amount of effort involved. So if you look along that, the further up you go, the more effort a business has to put into it, but also the greater the payback is. In the early days of kind of print on demand, our data was heavily used by people to figure out how many machines should they buy. It's still used by people in order to set long-term strategy in various markets. Though you don't have to do that either, you can also put in the minimum and only do the others. Now we have some graphs. In my job, there's a lot of graphs, so my apologies. There's going to be a lot of data, and I will try to make some kind of jokes, but that never works in translation. So let's see how we go. This is to try and illustrate the coloring books. I'm not sure if that was a phenomenon in Turkey or not. I presume it was. So it's just to show how mad those sales patterns were, and how basically books ran out of stock. So a normal book will run in a pattern, and the majority of the normal sales pattern for a book is maybe 12 to 13 weeks of its main sales. And if you run out of stock of a popular book, so not a law book or something that people have to buy, if it runs out of stock, you never get those sales back. And if a new phenomenon arrives, if you have data, you can try and manage it. But if it's unexpected, you can't even manage that. And this is a good illustration of that. The reason why I use that is to say that also sometimes people think that data will fix all of your problems, and not even in the book world. I mean, we're all seeing it in the kind of digital world. More data is not necessarily better, and it can be misused as well, or it can be misleading. But having data at least enables you to understand what's happening and then respond. Sorry, there's some kind of insect. That's annoying. We operate to a calendar, so it standardizes the months, because the world's calendar is fairly poor in that it keeps moving. So every 4 years we have to have a leap week, much like we have a leap day, which confuses people. But the important part of it is then when people are talking about sales in March, it's no longer March, it's a period of time that is fixed because of how the book world works. There's an amount of stock out there at any one point in time, and often people are using different definitions of time without realizing it. The speaker after me will hopefully enjoy this as a slide because it really matters. So up until now I've just kind of talked about sales measurement and it's very important and so on, but without categorization you can measure sales but you can't get very far. So this second part of the problem is then measuring and categorizing what you've sold, and you have to do that in order to have it be really useful. You can use sales information on its own, and nothing focuses the mind like a bestseller list with an ISBN but then no metadata, so no title and author. So we then map, this is just to illustrate what is possible more than anything else. We then map the categorization system of whichever market we're in into these standard areas, and it has been designed in order to fit with the retail world. In the UK we use BIC and now Thema. In many markets we actually map from multiple sort of classification systems because there's a need for that, but increasingly we use Thema where it's available and or IBIC or whatever. And because we have those, we can then do things like this. I'm going to do this so I can see my slides. There we go. Oh, that's a bit weird, but we'll do it. So because we've got value and volume, you can see that you can look at the differences in between those things, which is often very different because some books will sell in high volumes but then low values. And earlier we were talking about maximum prices, I think. We had a book that's sold in the UK, and the average sales price, not the recommended retail price, came out at £11,000. And we thought that surely this must be an error, so we queried it, and it wasn't an error. An oligarch had written an autobiography, and the cover had diamonds in it, and that was the actual price of the book. And I think they sold 4 copies, and it was profitable. And similarly, Taschen will sell books at prices that I think most people will be shocked that is actually what's sold. So value data is really important to have because this doesn't show it that well, but it has a huge influence. So then if you have this data, then you can obviously trend it over time for any amount of time you have, and then you can see as things change and as trends move. So in this one, popular science in the UK is really increasing hugely as a category. I'm happy to say, being interested in popular science. And as is also children's non-fiction, which again, a few years ago I don't think anybody would have predicted that. So in fiction, that's how many different genres we have and some examples of what you can do. That huge purple spike, there's no prizes for guessing what that is. 50 Shades was a real phenomenon. And then you can see afterwards, though, that market actually does pick up still, so it did have a longer term impact. It also shrunk the other markets. And then in black there you can see graphic novels slowly growing from a low base and really doing quite well. It's slightly cut off at the top, my apologies. You can obviously see what the best sellers are. But then if you look in a genre, you can work out if the growth within a genre is out of the mid-list, only the best sellers, the long tail, or where is the growth. So often the book market seems, we hear anecdotal things like it's only the best sellers that do well, or it's only the mid-list, or the long tail will save us, which is a kind of personal bugbear of mine. The long tail won't save anyone other than the man that wrote that book about the long tail, who he did quite okay. And some examples of that from authors, and another author. Then you can also look at, because there are multiple markets, you can understand how much of a genre is imported and translated fiction, and this very interesting phenomenon of things making their way around the world, and certain books that will do well in some countries but never do well in others, and then other books, and really what is driving the growth within a market. So in this point in the UK, this market actually grew 57%. So if you're a publisher in translated Scandinavian fiction, you can quantify it, figure out how much you should pay for rights, how much you should print, but almost more importantly, not overprint. So not get overexcited and not go, oh my word, it has grown 1,000%. It's only 57%. And then you can look at the print run and go, this is a realistic print run. Okay. Some examples out of trade nonfiction. So recently in the UK, very unexpectedly, so this is in sort of descending size. So the categories at the very top are the largest. So food and drink is the largest trade nonfiction. My joke is normally that the UK has an endless appetite for food and drink kind of books. And then popular science second, and so on. But a small category in natural history, animal and wildlife has grown absolutely spectacularly, and the Blue Planet sort of TV series and then tie-ins had a big amount actually to do with that, but it's not the only thing as well. There's lots of other books as well. Yeah, the rise and fall of parodies, helping publishers understand when to get on a bandwagon and when to get off of the bandwagon, because a lot of publishing is fundamentally that, or I could be nicer about it and not say bandwagon, but trend. So this is the number of ISBNs. So in 2015 there were only 11 of these books, then the next year there were 24 new ones, and then the next year there were 26 new ones. Arguably those 26 new ones should probably not have been published and have probably all made a loss, and if you looked at the data you could have probably avoided that. Self-help and improvement as a category is really doing well in the UK, which is kind of contrary to the stereotype of kind of British people not liking American-style self-help books. But if you look at it, you can see that it isn't that. So on the face of it, you might think it's one thing, but then if you analyze the data, then you can see it isn't. It's actually popular psychology and not really self-help. So here actually categorization will help you a lot, and you can also see the rise and fall of Hygge and like related things. So then popular science that I talked about, again you might think it's only one book, but it isn't. And then you can also see, is it really a trend, or is it only one book over 1 year? And if you're a publisher, that can inform how you select your list, how you acquire new content, how you repurpose older content. This is currently a favorite of mine, though perhaps not too many people, but bizarrely, because of our, in my personal opinion, terrible political choices with the EU, suddenly our public are interested in books about politics that a few years ago you couldn't have sold almost if you gave them away. There are people reading about constitutional law. That is not an exciting subject for the average person, but now it is really doing well and is rapidly growing. Does this thing work? Yeah, it does. So EU and European institutions, so these are all actually BIC, so these come out of BIC, so the product class only gets you so far, and then out of BIC you can work out. So actually politics and government is the largest kind of BIC category within this, and then EU and European institutions. Similarly, you can see the real reflection of other changes. Any sort of books relating to, and that could be near the era of feminism or even the Me Too movement or supporting young girls, is hugely up. And even though these things fall across all kind of different genres, from history to psychology to actually children's books, you can link them using categorization, find common codes, and understand that actually these things are connected. So children's, here it is it's a very common misconception that people are buying less children's books. This is simply untrue. It's actually at an all-time high in the UK since we started measuring. It's a way kind of more complex picture of, are they actually reading them, or how often are they reading them, or even more importantly, put how much more free time do people have. And here I want to segue a little bit kind of back to the fixed price law or anything aiming to support the industry as a whole. The largest competitor for a book, in my opinion, and lots of research will support it, isn't another book. It is YouTube if it is a child, or if it's a working person, it's actually their email. So if they're busy commuting or they're doing something, either do you answer your emails or do you read a book? So the competitor isn't other books, and I think that's hugely important to remember as we try to support and grow our kind of industry. Sure, we all compete with each other, but really we're competing for an ever shrinking amount of time a consumer and especially a child has. There's a lot of research amongst young kids where actually the parents, they're pushing them into so many activities. They have ballet, and then soccer, and then they have after school, and then they have a violin lesson. There's no time for them to read for leisure. There's a very big difference as well in between reading for leisure and reading because you have to at school. So the children's market, children's fiction, all the different ones, you can see how it works. You can see what the kind of best sellers are, unsurprising to us in the UK. But then you can see where things grow and shrink, and they can really change very rapidly over time, and you only know that if you measure it. So if you don't measure it, you might think that it stays about the same, and hopefully what I'm illustrating is it really doesn't, which is why it's important to go and measure it. As I said, general non-fiction actually doing really well, and a very positive thing in the UK, in my opinion, where there's this huge movement in non-fiction and also poetry. I spoke at a poetry summit recently where, because we have empirical data, we can actually prove that poetry sales are now up 3 years in a row, and something that was a really tiny genre is actually growing. And you can theorize, and if you look at the titles, it's a mixture of nostalgia and escapism, or attempting to understand our kind of modern political situation or flux within the world. If you have the data, then you can do an interesting, though slightly depressing, if like me with young children you had to read lots and lots of Peppa Pig books, how big Peppa Pig really is, because you can group them together. Because if you look at the individuals, they aren't that big, but if you look at them as a brand or as a thing, Star Wars and Lego are huge things, and then Peppa is also a huge brand. Da-da-da. I hate Paw Patrol, incidentally. I'm not sure if anyone here has ever seen Paw Patrol. If you have, I hope you, if you haven't, I hope you never have to. As examples, yeah, okay. And you can see the rise of authors very rapidly over time. And you can look at things like young adult fiction and how it changes over time, and how it helps you to understand as a publisher, is a genre just one book in a year, or is it more than one book in a year? So if you look at this year, that's effectively like other things only, and that's the rest of the market. And then you can see that's Hunger Games, and then you can see how big the other is. So actually what's happened here is, because people have identified it as a kind of growth market, everyone is busy competing for the same market. So it has gotten more and more and more competitive. So the other series element has gotten smaller and smaller, and non-series then has actually grown. So individual authors who aren't writing a series of 5 books or however many it is actually slowly growing, very counter to, I think, anecdotal evidence. I think anecdotally people believe it's only series, whereas that's actually the absolute opposite is true. And I could stand here all day doing that kind of thing, but I'm not going to, luckily. So that's me. The last thing I wanted to just talk about, if any industry wanted a sales measurement service like this, it's got a bunch of ingredients, but the key one is that it has to be the retailers who agree to share the data, and then it is primarily the publishers who actually pay for the data. So the retailers receive the same service back in return for sharing the data free of charge, and then the publishers subscribe to have the data, and they pay based on how big they are. So that a small publisher isn't actually disadvantaged from a large publisher. So the larger you are, the more you pay, even if you have exactly the same service. And it can only survive and thrive if it operates on this very, very transparent, independent, and I think fair kind of model. Every time we've tried any other model, it hasn't worked. Hopefully we won't make any new mistakes, but that's it. And then thank you for inviting me, and also thank you for your attention. Any questions? Yes. Where's the mic? It's behind there. It's on its way. And I need the translator. Sorry.
Do you pay to the retailers for the data?
We don't. We don't, which is very important. We don't. So the retailers receive the service in return, but they don't get paid to have their data. So the business model is the retailers share the data and they receive the service in return. I should say as well, no one sees any individual retailer's sales, only that retailer. So as an example, in the UK, Amazon participate in this, as they do in some other markets. They share their data, we do not pay them for their data. They receive the service back, but no one can see how big Amazon is unless Amazon sign a contract with me that says I may release this data to this publisher, which they do in some cases, but I don't pay for retail data. I do sometimes pay software suppliers to modify software to enable the delivery of data, but we don't pay for retail data. Yeah. It's a very good question, and it's a very key thing. Cheers. Any other questions? Over there's one.
Ülkenizdeki bu satış rakamlarını nasıl derliyorsunuz? Nasıl derleniyor? Nereden toplanıyor? Hem kitap adedi olarak soruyorum, hem şey olarak, gelir olarak, parasal açıdan.
Okay, so the volumes that we looked at, and I should have been more clear, is volume of copies bought by the end consumer, and we collect it out of a retailer's till system, and for an online retailer, out of their kind of warehouse. So if you go to a bookshop in anywhere in the UK, physical bookshop, and you buy a book, at the end of that day, that bookshop's EPOS till system sends a data file into a system that we have. If you buy it from an online retailer, at the end of every day, their warehouse sends us a copy of every transaction through their warehouse slash kind of sort of payment portal, and that's how we get volume and value. They only report ISBN volume, i.e. quantity, and the price paid. So the price you see is an aggregate of the average price paid by all the consumers. If I go, it's going to take a while. It's yeah, that's basically the summary of how we do it. In the UK, I am lucky that our business also operates the ISBN agency, so I have the record of every ISBN. I hope I've answered the question. Yes? Yeah.
Çok kısa, zorunlu uygulama mı ISBN İngiltere'de? Zorunlu uygulama mıdır ISBN ülkenizde? Yani bütün yayıncılar alıyor mu ISBN?
No, it is not. It is not mandatory to have an ISBN, and many people publish without ISBN. I don't think all books need an ISBN either. But any book that you'd like to trade with the wider book market, it is much more efficient to have an ISBN. We sell ISBNs in the UK for a fairly low price, but we sell them. In other markets, actually, they give them away. So in the Indian book market, as an example, their government gives away ISBNs to any publisher that would like one, and it's how it operates. It just helps it work, but it isn't mandatory, I think, anywhere. It is just a standard in order to make things more efficient. It isn't compulsory.
Are you giving the numeric distribution? Numeric one?
What? I'm not.
How many shelf faces, for example?
Shops.
Yeah, shelf faces. Yeah. How many faces of this book, for example?
That's a really good question. We don't in this. We do other research like that, and to an extent we do. For the supermarket world, they do that a lot. In the book world, it's kind of done occasionally on an individual sort of project basis, not all the time, just because it is too expensive to do.
Yeah.
So it's possible, but it's expensive.
Okay. Thank you.
No? That's it. Yes. Thank you very much for your time. If you have any other questions, you can ask me afterwards. Cheers. Thank you.